can now open your Bibles to Psalm 16, which will be our text for today. It's Psalm 16. I'll begin reading at verse 1. Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you I have no good thing. I say of the holy people who are in the land, they are the noble ones in whom is all my delight. Those who run after other gods will suffer more and more. I will not pour out libations of blood to such gods, or take up their names on my lips. Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. I will praise the Lord who counsels me. Even at night my heart instructs me. I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest secure. Because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful ones see decay. You make known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Thus far, the reading. Brothers and sisters, as you all know, this week we've moved to stage 3 of the Ontario reopening plan. After more than 15 months of COVID, we're very thankful for such a thing. One of the greatest pleasures of this summer is to live as if COVID doesn't really exist. Most of us have mostly forgotten about it and are busy trying to forget it, except for the masks that we're still required to wear. No doubt the disease still lingers, but overall we're moving in the right direction. And at this point we have an opportunity to maybe look back and reflect a little bit. What happened in the last year and why? And perhaps one of the most significant points of reflection is the concept of safety. Keeping people safe has been the mantra for the last year and a half. Hundreds and billions of dollars have been spent. Whole societies and nations have been locked down. Hundreds of millions vaccinated, all in the name of safety. Public safety. And, if we pull back from the situation, sometimes it's worth considering what safety really is. When is safety achieved? Who ensures that I'm going to be safe? And our culture has a clear answer. It's the government's job, and it's our job to help the government. And we shouldn't discount this as Christians. Certainly the government bears responsibility, and so do we, for the safety of our culture. But as Christians, it's also worth considering, can the government actually keep you safe? 26,500 people died of COVID-related causes. They were not kept safe. 1.4 million people got COVID in Canada. They were not kept safe. If you put your faith in human institutions, this is an uncomfortable reality that no matter how hard we try, risks still endure. Even despite the most massive concerted effort, perhaps in human history, to fight disease, we are still at risk. And what's curious is that here in Psalm 16, our passage, there's a different idea of safety. Safety found in a different place by different means. And curiously, if we read verse 1, it says this: "Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge." Which is an entirely different view of safety, isn't it? But today, let's work through this and how we can sing and think about a psalm on this topic under this theme: safety in the inheritance of God. And before we jump quickly into Psalm 16, I want to do something a little bit unusual. I want to do a little bit of a diversion, because I want to spend some time together thinking about how we interpret Psalms. Because if we don't do that, then Psalm 16 may still not be useful even after preaching on it. And I want to first spend a little bit of time on this question: what is a psalm? How do we understand them? And why am I preaching one to you? Let's work this out, and we'll return to Psalm 16. The Psalms, as you know, come from the Old Testament. They are a collection of poetry and song written by Old Testament saints. They are devotional in nature. And what I really want to impress in this part of this section is the Psalms are people living in regular life, and the Psalms are specifically how they relate what they experience to God. They are the vertical dimension of someone's life, abstracted from their life. And now, again, this is where Psalm 16 comes into play again. Psalm 16 is attributed to David, King David. King David, if you don't know, is one of the most famous Old Testament figures. He's well known even outside of the church. King David is this incredibly powerful king. He's skilled in battle and war. He's one of the mightiest warriors that has ever lived, and yet he has this incredibly deep heart. And he writes many songs. He wrote 73 of the Psalms. His life is astonishingly dramatic. This is a man who lived larger than almost anyone else. Right? He's constantly in danger, constantly. His life is full of battles, intrigue. He becomes immensely wealthy. He has this harem of many wives and concubines. And the Bible includes many stories from how David lived. We remember David and Goliath. We remember his long years of exile in the desert, which we read about earlier. His friendship with Jonathan, King Saul's son, even though King Saul is trying to kill him. And what's curious is that you have 73 Psalms, and only a handful are attributed to being attached to a particular event in David's life. The vast majority have no reference to exactly what prompted David to sing or write the psalm. Why? This has often puzzled people, and many preachers, when they preach on the Psalms, what they'll try to do, they'll try to figure out which story in David's life should be attached to the psalm. But this is actually not the best. What's curious about the Psalms is that they indeed are the vertical words of David, abstracted from what prompted him to write them. David was constantly relating what he saw and experienced to God, always. He lived coram Deo. That is, he lived in the presence of God. Under the presence of God, maybe we could say. Everything related to God. If he had a victory, he thanked God. If he was particularly low or under threat, he cried out to God for help. And it was always like this. And the Psalms, they capture that. And they capture just that. And what's so valuable about capturing only what David said to God and not all the other details of the story is that what David said becomes applicable to every one of our lives in all places at all times. It means that any Christian can sing any of David's Psalms, because they don't depend on what the events that actually happened in David's life. And that means that we can sing the Psalms as if they're our own. We can use the Psalms to express how we feel to God and back. They can guide us when we don't understand how God relates to what we're experiencing. They can lift us when we feel beyond God's reach, because many of the Psalms are sung by people who, and by David, when he feels like God doesn't care. And so this is how I want to begin to enter Psalm 16. How would you write yourself into Psalm 16? I mean, what would this mean if you wrote this? You see? Now, that doesn't mean we divorce David from the whole. No, we use David's life in this. But how do we live this and think this? And why would we sing something like this? And how would we be able to? And how do we worship God through this now? And I think this is the framework we want to build as we begin thinking about Psalms. And this is how we enter Psalm 16, verse 1, where David says, "Keep me safe, my God, for in you I take refuge." And what if we said, "Lord, keep us safe, for you are our refuge"? And we'd say this. What David is really saying here is he's saying, "Lord, you are where I find safety. You're the person I've always depended for my safety. So, I'm facing danger now. Keep me safe, Lord. Do who you are." And again, how striking is this? Here you have a man, David. This is a man who has lived one of the most unsafe lives that has ever existed. David was constantly in danger. That's why we read this passage from 1 Samuel 23, right? Where David he's running. He goes to this town of Keilah, and he thinks he's safe there. Turns out the town is willing to turn him over to Saul. Saul is relentlessly pursuing David, and people are betraying him at every single turn. David is finally so unsafe. Saul is on one side of the mountain, and David's on the other side, and Saul's army is much larger. He is perpetually unsafe for years. And you would expect that such a man would either run from Israel, although he did do that briefly, or that he would become a man who would have learned to depend on his sword and his skill, and fortresses and allies. And David was a powerfully skilled man. And on many occasions he escaped Saul through his own skill and cunning. And you would think, oh man, there's a man who can defend himself. If only I was like David, then I would be secure, right? Or here's a king that we can depend on. Here's a government we can depend on. He'll keep us safe. And yet we have these words, "Keep me safe, my God, for I take refuge in you." What a statement, and how countercultural and, shall we say, pre-modern. Nothing I have can keep me safe, only God can. Again, think of what we see around us. We could describe the last year as the year of our obsession with health and safety. Every single decision made in our society is based on safety. Everything else subordinated to that goal, and yet we are still not safe. Again, I'm not here to talk about COVID policies. I don't really care. And I'm not sure God is here that's what he would want here in this building. We're here to focus on how our hearts are dealing with this. And are we able as people to leave this with God, or do we get so wrapped up in how this is what's going on that we just can't find any peace? And the question, what is true safety, and is it possible for me in my life? And here's the question, another question. If safety is your number one priority, will you actually ever find it? Is safety something that if you try really hard, it comes closer? Or is it true that the harder you try, the more elusive it becomes? And perhaps if safety becomes your obsession, then it requires sacrifices of blood that perhaps you're not willing to bear. And this is a question every single one of us has an answer to. Every one of us has already answered this question in our hearts somehow. When am I truly safe? And every one of us is acting on our answer. Some will say, I'm only safe if I'm in a place where everyone wears masks and stays 6 feet apart. Others will say, I'm safe regardless of what other people are doing because my immune system will survive COVID. Underneath, both answers are actually the same. They depend on what I do. We could expand this beyond COVID. Others will say, I'm only safe because if there's no crime in my neighborhood and if the police come quick enough. I'm only safe as long as I don't take the bus at night or drive at night. I'm only safe if I avoid bad people. Or my children are only safe if I keep an eye on them at all times. Or if they go to the right school, or who knows what, we could say. Here's another one. I'm only safe if no one really knows me. If people truly know me, they would be able to gossip about me and I wouldn't be safe anymore. Now, of course, there's wisdom in doing certain things to avoid bad situations and threats. We should use the means available to keep safety to a certain extent. Of course we do. We value human life. We don't treat it recklessly. That's why we wear seatbelts. That's why we inspect our meat. We don't take unreasonable risks because that is to play with God's life. But again, when you think about safety and fear, is God part of that thought process? And this is the question of Psalm 16. David is saying in Psalm 16, he's saying, look, when I think about my safety, I only think about God. I only consider who my Lord is. That's my thought process in terms of safety. And then, therefore, we can read verses 9 and 10. Look what it says. Therefore, my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body will also rest secure. Why will it rest secure? Because you, God, will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one see decay. This is his affirmation. No, I have confidence in the Lord. In you, my body will rest secure, God. Now, some of you might say at this point, how strange. I've seen God abandon Christian people to death. I've seen good Christian people die in a car accident. God did not keep them safe. What we need to realize is that David's not really talking about human death here. The curious thing is that these verses are quoted twice in the New Testament. First time in Acts 2, verse 25 through 28. And there the Apostle Peter is preaching a sermon in Jerusalem. And he uses these texts to reference the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. They're proofs of Jesus' resurrection, he says. In Acts 13, verse 35, the Apostle Paul does the same thing again. He references Psalm 16, and he says, Jesus rose from the dead, and this is proof that he would. And at first glance, you think, man, that's odd. The Father let Jesus die. He did not keep Jesus safe. And Jesus was beaten and flogged. He experienced great danger. How can Jesus confess the words of Psalm 16? My body will rest secure. And suddenly we realize that if you read a psalm like this, you realize that maybe safety isn't a matter of avoiding death or threats to life, is it? Safety is perhaps something bigger. Safety is perhaps what we would call, it's more about who and what who is doing. Maybe safety is about promises from the right person, not deadbolts and masks. Safety, in fact, is when the Father of heaven and earth has said that you will survive death. Safety is when the Father of heaven and earth has said, I unite myself to you forever, and I will never abandon you. Even death cannot separate me from you. Romans 8, verse 37 through 38. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, nor the present nor the future, and we could go on, will separate us from the love of God. And so what David is really saying is he's saying ultimate safety for me is not the absence of danger. It's knowing that the love of God is bigger than my danger. No danger, including death, can separate me from the love of Christ that will cause me to triumph over danger. This means that Christians don't have to bow down to the idol of safety after all. We can take risks in love. For good reasons, we can risk. For the sake of Christ. Not because we like risk or we want to face danger, but because we can face it for the right reasons. Now again, part of the reason David is singing this psalm is because God did deliver him from a temporary problem. And if you read the stories of David, you will find that God delivered him again and again and again, and in ways that were not explainable through human means. And so God can deliver us from great danger in this life. And I would argue that in this congregation, COVID hardly touched us. That is a blessing, seeing as we live in the COVID hotspot, shall we say. Did our congregation's experience with COVID, was that simply a human thing? Or is God involved in that in a deeper way than most of us would imagine? Now, there are times when you might say, okay, yes, but there are times when God didn't deliver David. See, God's not always there for you. Well, even in those times, David would cry out to God too, you see. Look at Psalm 13, for example. Psalm 13 is a psalm of David. Look what it starts with. How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? My enemy will say, I have overcome him. So it looks like David's enemies are triumphing. And yet, the issue you see in this psalm is David is saying, it's not that the God has to deliver him from the danger. It's more that, God, if you don't deliver me from this, people will think that you don't care for me or that you're not who you say you are. His concern is God's glory. He says, don't let evildoers triumph, for that will defame your name, God. Don't let the world get the message that God does not care for his people. And therefore, Lord, act in my situation. Don't be far from me. Whether he lives or dies is not really the primary concern. He cares about the kingdom of Israel, and he cares about God's name. Just like the Apostle Paul says in Philippians 1, for to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. And what's so striking is that for Jesus, to die was gain. He voluntarily faced something that was unsafe for the sake of other people. And then by so doing, Jesus gave us the second gift, which was the gift of defeat over death. He rose from the dead and showed that, in fact, the promises of God in Psalm 16 are actually real for more than David. They're real for people who believe in Jesus in every place, in every time, in all places. And this gives us a radically different view of danger. Keep me safe, God, for in you I take refuge. So what's danger then? Danger is being torn away from Christ. Danger is Satan. Right? And then you make known to me the path of life. That's verse 11. You, Lord, make known to me the path of life. The most dangerous thing I face is being taken off the path of life with Jesus and being put on a path where I serve something other than Christ. Because I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. And do we believe that? I will not. What am I going to be shaken about? I'm going to be. I can't be shaken from the path of life. This is the great danger for the Christian. Now, again, I think many of you might say, well, that's great. Isn't that a little extreme? We just depend on God and our fears go away, right? That's a little... I don't really believe that. I mean, yeah, we do carry a lot of fears, and it does seem far-fetched to simply say, put my refuge in God. Let me tell you a story. This is a story of a man named Brother Yun. Brother Yun is a Chinese Christian who suffered greatly in the 80s for being a Christian in China. He led a house congregation that became very prominent, so prominent that eventually the authorities put him in jail. He's eventually arrested in 1984. He's beaten mercilessly. He's placed in prison. The prison treats him horribly. Even the other inmates treat him horribly. He's constantly brought into courtrooms, and they try to convince him to give up all the other members of his house church. Right? So he's facing the threat of physical pain. He's facing emotional pain. It's just everything. He's not safe. He went months without seeing his family. He doesn't see his son until his son is 4 years old. Then he's finally sentenced to 4 years of hard labor where he has to work 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. And yet, after his release in 1988, he pens the following words. Through it all, God was always faithful and loving to me. He had never left me nor forsaken me. His grace was always sufficient, and he provided for my every need. Let me say this. This is a man who experienced the most dangerous situation imaginable, and yet believes in his heart that God never left him. And it would therefore stand to reason that our lesser fears, if the danger that we fear were to come to pass, that God would be faithful through that danger as well. Whatever that danger may be, a criminal breaking into your home, losing one of your children to death, a car accident. The question is, do you believe? And if Jesus is who he says he is, will he be there for you when you face that most difficult of moments, that greatest of trials? And Brother Yun is saying, yes, absolutely, Jesus was there. Psalm 16, right? I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. And Brother Yun said this too. He said, look, I didn't suffer for Jesus in prison. What? No. I was with Jesus and I experienced his very real presence, joy, and peace every day. It is not those in prison for the sake of the gospel who suffer. The person who suffers is he who never experiences God's intimate presence. Whoa. That's hard to believe as a Canadian Christian. And what he is saying, brothers and sisters, he's saying life and joy is to know Christ. Pain and death is to not know him. Life is to live on coram Deo in the presence of God. That's why David is able to say the beautiful words of verse 2. Look what he says, right? I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. Whew. We've got lots of good things in Canada, right? Do we believe this? I think, but it's true, you see? It has to be true. If Jesus is the height of the good, if Jesus is the person who is the only person who is perfectly good, it must necessarily be true that anything apart from him will cause nothing but sorrow. It must be true. It cannot logically be otherwise. Right, this is what verses 5 through 6. Lord, you alone are my portion and my cup. You make my lot secure. The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Surely I have a delightful inheritance. You see, Again, remember, the nation of Israel, they're slaves in Egypt. God brings them out as slaves. He brings them to their own land, and he gives them the land of Canaan, land of Palestine. And part of that gift was that every family in Israel got a piece of land in perpetuity. And even if they sold that land, it was returned to them at certain points. And there was this question of who got the good inheritance? Whose land was the best? Now, one tribe did not receive land. They only received a few towns, the Levites. The Levites' job was to serve the temple of God. That serving God in the temple was their inheritance. And people donated livestock and such to sustain them. And David is saying, my inheritance in the land is God. And that's the best, and that's good. I don't need the rest. God is my inheritance. There's no better inheritance. And that's why Brother Ewan is able to say, I didn't suffer for Jesus in prison. No, I experienced him. He was my real presence. He was my portion, my inheritance. I didn't suffer. I was with my portion. And if that's true, then the opposite is also true. Those who run after other gods will suffer more and more. What does it say here? We could say, verse 4, those who run after other gods will experience increasing sorrow. Christ is the sweetest taste, the height of the good, the height of the beauty, the most magnificent of love. And the language here, by the way, those who run after other gods, this is the language of betrothal. Those who run after a woman. If you run after other gods, as if you pursue a woman, well, sorrow will result. But then the opposite. If you run after Jesus, as if you run after, you pursue a woman as a man, you will experience the joy, the inheritance. And we can finish with this. What is safety for the Christian? Well, safety is where God is. Safety is the words of God. Safety is believing God's words as if they're true. And we've learned this in COVID. Was COVID a danger to us in this church? No. That's not to say that we didn't take precautions or that we're careless. No. We also do things for the well-being of other people. Fine. But the only real danger COVID posed to you was to take you away from God. That was COVID's danger. And in that sense, the isolation of COVID was perhaps its worst quality. If we see that, and if you see things that way, then suddenly you realize that a world without COVID is also a dangerous world. Perhaps a more dangerous world than COVID for some of us. The pleasures of freedom and security carry an equal, if not greater, danger. What do we do with our freedom? That will tell you how dangerous your freedom can be. And when we face the dangers of life, brothers and sisters, may we be able to sing and write ourselves into Psalm 16. And you face danger, or you face threats, and you are filled with fear over something, open your Bible to Psalm 16 and begin to rewrite the psalm as if you are singing it, and then bring it to your lips and sing it. Not because the psalm is so profound, but because this psalm tells us who God is and who Jesus is. And the psalm tells us that we're not alone. We're never alone, really. We just think we are at times. Because with Jesus at our right hand, we cannot be shaken. He is the safety of safety. And in his safety is the kind of safety that can never be taken away, but it only becomes more vivid over time. It's a safety that lasts forever. So brothers and sisters, let's use Psalm 16 to sing praise to God and to be comforted in who he is. Amen.